office for an afternoon. Okay, so as also already referenced, I have over 30 years experience really as a software developer and building and developing and leading development organizations. But interestingly, I spent the last 2 years over in DCU locked up in a classroom with over 20 psychologists studying work and organizational behavior. What was kind of interesting about that, and something that I could never actually understand, was that all these psychologists always thought that it was really strange that there was a tech guy in the class. They just could never get that I would have an interest in this topic. They seemed to believe that I should be studying kind of computer science or data science or one of these topics. And would always ask, why are you here anyway? And I would try and explain it. Well, it's quite simple. Because for me, this is about how do you motivate people in a modern kind of work environment. And even that, for some reason, was kind of lost on them. But this is a topic that I've always been passionate about. I think maybe it comes from a background playing sports, you know, where this is not really that unusual a concept. People, particularly people playing in a team, will have a certain level of talent, maybe even an extreme level of talent. But there are other factors that when you play a game or whatever it is that you're doing determine an individual's performance, and it mightn't necessarily just be their level of talent, and usually that kind of is in the area of kind of how motivated people are when they walk on the pitch or when you walk into an office first thing in the morning. So I'm really excited, kind of that's really what this talk is about, is just try to share the outcome of the research-based dissertation that I completed at the end of last year, and I hope there are some things in here that you might find interesting and will give you something to think about when you're either considering as a leader, motivating your people, or maybe considering the kind of environment and organization that you should be looking for as an individual. Okay, so motivating knowledge workers, and research on motivating and leading a modern workforce. So let's just set some context around what I'm talking about here. So first of all, work motivation. So this is the official organizational behavior definition of work motivation, not words that I have generated. An energetic force that initiates work-related behavior and determines its form, intensity, and direction. Okay, so work-related behavior that has form, intensity, and direction. That's what we mean by work motivation. I referenced modern workforce, and I referenced knowledge workers on the heading of the slide deck. So what do we mean there? This is quite simple. I'm going to take a guess that pretty much everybody in this room could be considered to be a knowledge worker. We are people who think for a living. Specifically, when I explain this, I always think of my father. My father was a baker. He worked on a production line. It's manual work. He didn't really need to think. He just needed to do. I think, in general, people in our industry, it's the other way around. We have skills we do need to do, but the most critical thing that we do is think. We're normally dealing with complexity. We're normally solving problems. We're normally being creative, as in coming up with new solutions to problems. And we're normally being kind of innovative in how we do our work. And there's a fundamental difference from that perspective in terms of how do you motivate that type of individual compared to how would you have motivated someone like my father 30, 40, 50 years ago when he was working. And then modern organizations. So the context here again, I think is relevant. My research most definitely really focused on this. And the distinction is kind of, it's the same actually. It's the type of organization maybe that my father would have worked in, where maybe there was 100, 200, 300 employees who primarily were manual workers. Right? We needed them to do stuff, but we didn't necessarily need them to be creative and to think and to problem solve. If you look at a modern organization, when you're talking about Zalando, or if we're talking about your organizations, again, I'm going to hazard a guess that this is common across all of our organizations. There's complexity. We're dealing with complexity in our job. People in the organization are required to be creative, innovative, and problem solve. Most importantly, normally, there's a significant amount of change, and organizations today, modern organizations, operate at a significant amount of pace. I don't know about you guys, but I would have said that 5 years ago, that was true. I would have said 3 years ago. And I'm looking at Paulina now, and I'm going to say it's even more true today than it ever was. Work is just getting quicker and quicker, it's more demanding, and the pace that we're being asked to work at just seems to be increasing all the time. Not really sure that's a good thing, but that's just the reality of the situation. Because of this, our organizations, compared to more traditional organizations, expect some behaviors from people. They expect us to be adaptive and proactive. So what that means is when stuff happens, we need to react to it. Unlike in the old days where, well, I don't get paid to worry about that, that's above my pay grade. We'll just bang that issue upstairs to the boss, and those guys can make a decision, and when they've made a decision, they can inform us, and then my boss can figure out how we should react. And then once he tells me what to do, probably sometime next week, I'll go and do that. Our jobs are just not like that, right? We're expected to be at the coalface. When we see an issue, we're expected to start this process of problem solving and being creative and being innovative with regard to whatever issues are there. So adaptive and proactive behaviours, really key requirements of all knowledge workers working in modern organisations. Okay, so just given if that's the context, before I get into the research, I'd like to take maybe 5-10 minutes just to give you some of the background on some of the science behind human motivation, and I guess some of the things that I certainly learned over the last 2 years, which I'm not too sure if I knew this 2 years ago. So, human motivation. For me, the interesting thing about this is that we are all born to be curious, proactive, and motivated. Like this is not an evolved behaviour. This is something that quite literally exists within our DNA. So Rory was talking about evolution earlier, so there's the very same principles at play here. Specifically, what drives motivation are what are known as 3 basic psychological needs. So, from an organizational behavior perspective, the word basic there carries a lot of meaning. Again, this means it's not an evolved behavior, or sorry, it's not a learned behavior, it's an evolved behavior. So this exists within each and every one of us. The first of the 3 needs is something called competence. So again, think about this from a survival perspective. It's critical when you're born that you have a drive within you to master your environment. Think about a baby developing a need to get up and crawl and start moving, or to just moving its hands, to develop the dexterity and the manual skills that baby is going to need. Nobody coaches a child how to do that. It's just an inbuilt drive within a child. That's an example from our early days, but this applies in work as well. If we feel competent, or if we feel like we have the ability to develop competence to do the job, we feel good about the job. If we don't have competence, or if we fail to believe that we can develop that competence, we're not going to feel motivated, we're not going to feel good about what we're doing and about the job itself. The second psychological need is relatedness. So again, this is a very deep-seated trait within all of us. We're social animals as humans. We do have this desire, this inbuilt desire, to form groups, to form societies, to form communities, and to act together. If we didn't have this, I mean, just think, would we have societies? Would we have cities? You know, it's absolutely fundamental to who we are. As a consequence of this, we do also have a desire. Again, think about it from a newborn perspective. You have this desire, this dependency on your parents, and your family, and those caregivers, those people that are around you. It's absolutely critical from a survival perspective that you have that desire to be part of that group. But again, this is something that we carry with us throughout our lives. We do care what other people think, regardless of what we say. We do care what other people think. We do like to make a positive impression on others. So these issues exist in work, obviously, where as humans, we do have a desire to be part of the group. We do have a desire to be part of the team, and it's really critical to us and our own personal well-being that we satisfy a need to be part of a group. The third psychological need is autonomy. Now, this one causes a lot of confusion in actual fact. So I'll just clarify this one straight away. People typically take this to mean independence. I'm autonomous, I'm free and independent from everybody and everything else. We in Zalando, actually, we've had a lot of fun with this one, and we've seen a lot of kind of poor behaviours even around this one, because people take it to mean independence. I'm free from the organisation, I can do what I want. Clearly from an organisational perspective it doesn't mean that, but from the science perspective it doesn't mean that either. What this means is experiencing choice, basically. If this meant independence, clearly we would have a big contradiction there as well in terms of relatedness and independence. Wait a minute, I want to be part of the group, but I want to be independent. How can I be both? So it doesn't mean independence. It means experiencing choice. So again, if you think back to your younger years, probably when you were a teenager, you get to that certain age where it starts to bother you that your parents are making all the big decisions for you, and you probably react badly to that. So it's not that you want to be independent, you still want to be part of the family group. That's a critical relationship in your life, but you certainly do want to be in control of the big decisions and the big choices that relate to you and your future and so on and so forth. So autonomy means experiencing choice and not necessarily independence. Okay, so I think really the biggest takeaway from this is the fact that these are basic psychological needs. This is inherent in all of us. Sometimes you get people, they develop an understanding that, well, that sounds like a kind of Western, maybe American idea, maybe in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, culture's kind of different. In Asia, maybe the culture's different. People wouldn't look at it this way. Not true. There's over 40 years worth of science that verifies that not only is this fact, but that this is universal. Now what that means is it doesn't matter where you come from, where you exist on the planet, who you are, what your background is, or what your experiences are. Each and every one of us has these three basic psychological needs, and when these are satisfied, it has a really positive effect on us. But so, I mean, a really obvious question then is, okay, if we all have this, should we all be really motivated? Because that seems kind of strange, because even if we look at ourselves, we realize there are times when we're motivated, there are times when we're not so motivated. So obviously, yes, there are other factors at play here, and probably the biggest factor of all is the actual environment that you exist in, and that's probably true for every evolved behavior. The environment around you is going to have the biggest impact on how these things are experienced. So think about a plant. The plant is inherently built to turn from a seed and grow and blossom and produce flowers and pollen and so on and so forth. The thing is, though, a plant is completely dependent on the surrounding environment and the nutrients that it provides. So in that way, people are like plants. If we receive water and sunshine, we will grow and thrive. If we satisfy the three basic psychological needs, air, nutrients, we will grow and thrive. But just like a plant, if we're in an environment that doesn't satisfy those three basic psychological needs, we will fail to thrive, we will fail to grow, we will fail to develop, and we certainly won't be motivated. Okay, so when specifically, of course, what we're talking about is work motivation. So when it comes to work motivation, obviously the most critical environment we can talk about is the work environment itself. So when it comes to work motivation, and in actual fact it's human motivation, there are actually 5 different flavors of motivation that people can experience. I don't really want to go into that, so we're going to bring that up a level, and what that means is that we're going to talk about a superset, basically, of human motivation, and let me explain. You may have come across some of these concepts. So the first form is something called controlled motivation, and this really means that there's an external entity, something external to us, is trying to control us and trying to motivate us. And normally in work, of course, that's done through the promise of rewards, of a gold star, a financial reward, and maybe even the concept of a carrot and stick. So that last one's kind of important because you can also achieve controlled motivation through a threat of punishment. So it doesn't even necessarily need to be a positive concept. But either way, we are looking, me as the leader of this organization, I'm looking to control you people by promising financial reward or some kind of gold star or some reward of some kind. The other form of motivation is something called autonomous motivation. Now this is different because it comes from within the individual. It's easy to kind of think about this one and visualize this one yourself. I think, again, a consequence of the type of jobs we do, we're probably in the jobs we do because we at least had a certain amount of interest in the things that we do. So whether that's software development, whether that's UX or UI, whether that's data science, you probably have at least a base level of kind of passion that's inherent within you for that particular topic. That's probably a good example of autonomous motivation. These things are experienced differently as an individual. When you have controlled motivation, I feel like I'm doing something because I have to do it, right? And again, think about that. I'm threatening you with punishment, or I'm promising you a reward of some kind. So you decide, okay, I better do this. I'm going to get in trouble if I don't do it. Or look, I'm going to get a bonus. It's probably going to be worth it. I wouldn't mind going on holidays this kind of summer. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be effective. It will generate motivation to do an activity. The thing is, though, all the science, and again, I'm talking about at this stage over 40 years worth of science, shows that autonomous motivation is significantly better when it comes to doing work that requires problem solving, creativity, or innovation, right? In other words, the type of work that we do. Okay, so given that, it's kind of clear to us, right? Our organizations, and as leaders of these organizations, we've got to be aiming for autonomous motivation rather than controlled motivation. So let's just take a slightly deeper look at that again, okay? So I mentioned at the start that there were 5 different flavors of human motivation, and controlled and autonomous are just kind of supersets of some of those forms. So let's just take a closer look at autonomous motivation. So there are 2 different types of motivation within autonomous motivation, and it's worth going into this detail because, again, I'm looking at Paulina. I believe a lot of the mistakes we made in Zalando around a lot of the things we were implementing around autonomy were for these reasons, and let me try and explain. So the first kind is intrinsic motivation. So again, this is probably a term people have heard of and people are aware of, and in actual fact, when I gave the description earlier of autonomous motivation, you were probably replacing one with the other. But that's okay, it's definitely a form of autonomous motivation. So again, this is something that comes from within you. I got into writing software because actually I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the process of having a problem, having to think. I loved writing code. You have some issues. You don't know what's going wrong. You go into this kind of problem-solving mode, and then you crack it. You have that eureka moment, and then you run the software. And this thing that you visualized is now a reality in front of you. And for me, that was a fantastic process. It's a great way to earn a living. I certainly was very, very kind of passionate about that. I had a level of intrinsic motivation for doing that kind of work. However, there is another form of autonomous motivation, and this is something called identified motivation. And with intrinsic motivation, it's internal, it comes from within you. But identified motivation is kind of interesting here from a work motivation perspective because it can come from an external factor. Now we did talk about this earlier with controlled motivation, but it is an external motivator, but this form definitely exists within autonomous motivation. Now let me try and explain the difference between the two of them here. Intrinsic motivation is basically, comes from within, but it's about, think about the things that you enjoy doing or that you find interesting. And that's kind of the problem then from a work motivation perspective. I enjoy a lot of what I do. I find a lot of what I do interesting. But not everything I do is enjoyable, and not everything I do is interesting. So in other words, in a work environment, intrinsic motivation will only get you so far. Right? There are a lot of things we have to do in work that are just not inherently interesting and enjoyable. And this is the mistake people make then, or organizations make, because they set up initiatives based on intrinsic motivation, based on trying to, generate motivation within you, but that's not possible because it has to come from within you. It can't come from me. And not only that, there's a real danger here, because if you have intrinsic motivation for a topic, if I start trying to mess with that, typically what happens is I actually undermine your intrinsic motivation. So I would make the argument that think of intrinsic motivation in terms of your hobbies, okay? So for me, really good example here, I started playing golf. I took it up last year. I've always loved sports, and I'm just too old now for the more kind of contact version of sports, so I'm now an old man playing golf. I'm really not very good. Actually, I'm really terrible, and I actually can't explain it. I play around. Typically, I come off the course, I'm frustrated. I can't understand why I'm as bad as I am, and I feel like breaking a couple of clubs across my knee, and I get in the car and I drive home. But by the time I get home, I kind of want to go again, because I don't know, I can't explain it, but I have some deep sense from a competence perspective. I know I can get better. I play with my two sons, so we've a great bit of banter when we play, so there's that kind of relatedness thing. And I definitely have choices. No one is forcing me to go. I want to go. So every weekend when I get in the car to head to the golf course, I have a level of excitement that's kind of like a kid on Christmas morning. Maybe not quite as much as that, but I'm definitely excited, And that's a real positive thing to have in your life. But I'm definitely experiencing intrinsic motivation towards playing golf at the moment. Do I experience that in work? Sometimes, but not all the times. Identified motivation. A great example of this is my wife. My wife is a nurse. We've been going out together since we were kids, basically. And I remember long before we were married, she was training. I picked her up outside the hospital. We were going into town. She was living in the hospital at the time. I asked her how her day went, and she was really excited. She was really, really buzzing with excitement. And I was like, well, how did it go? I mean, what happened today? Because clearly something really important had happened. And she explained to me how she gave this woman a bed bath and fixed her up and left her. And she was really clean. And I couldn't understand. I mean, imagine doing that. I mean, for me personally, I just couldn't imagine. But not only did she do it, but she was really, really excited about doing it. But of course, I didn't understand it. This kind of struck me because that story always stuck in my head. I always kind of admired her, but I didn't really understand it. But of course, this is what it was, because my wife comes from a family of nurses. Ever since she was a little girl, it's all she ever wanted to do. She went through school, she studied hard. All she ever wanted to be was a nurse. And this act of caring for this lady who was incapable of caring for herself And even though this lady couldn't thank her, she wasn't able to speak, it didn't really matter. My wife didn't need that. So what she was getting was a sense of importance from the job that she was doing that was completely aligned with her own set of values and her own set of goals in terms of who she was and what she wanted to be. So that's identified motivation, and that's the distinction between the two. Okay, so from a work perspective, if you've got individuals that have intrinsic motivation, fantastic. But really don't try and mess with it, because there's nothing you can do to generate it, but it's very easy to diminish it. So just support it. But from a work perspective, what you should be trying to do is focus on this concept of identified motivation, where you're helping people see how important the work is, and you're helping to align that work with people's sense of value and their own goals. Something kind of magical happens when you do that. It's called internalization. So although this is an external motivator coming from the business, people internalize the concept, and they experience identified motivation in exactly the same way as they experience intrinsic motivation. So this is what you should be aiming for, ideally. Don't undermine any intrinsic motivation that exists, and try and generate identified motivation where you can. The science, again, there's over 40 years of research that show this. When you achieve this, this is where you get enhanced performance from people in the workplace. Okay, so let's just look a little bit then, if that's the science and some of the background, let's just talk a little bit about the research. So clearly, autonomous motivation for people that need to be creative, for people that need to be innovative, for people who deal in complexity and who have to problem solve for a living, who think for a living. Autonomous motivation is what we need to achieve for these people. So the obvious question is, how do you create autonomous motivation in people? Well, guess what? I explained the 3 psychological needs and satisfying those 3 psychological needs. So all the science that exists suggests that satisfy the 3 psychological needs, and you, of competence, relatedness, and autonomy, and you generate autonomous motivation in people. Now, I keep saying there's like over 40 years of science that says this, which there is. So why did I have to do any research on this if we already know this? Well, that's a good question. There's a lot of research out there that says this, but as best we can tell, no research has ever been done in a high-tech organization such as Zalando. It's been done across multiple other domains. So from an academic perspective, that was an item of interest. Does this hold true in a tech organization, or for people like us doing the type of jobs that we do? So, okay, great. Satisfy the 3 psychological needs. So how do we do that exactly? So I kind of made a statement earlier, the environment is probably the biggest factor here. So when it comes to the work environment, again, we in Zalando, we had rolled out a lot of initiatives around autonomy and autonomous teams. I observed a lot of really kind of interest there, what I felt were poor behaviors or maybe mistakes that we had made. You know, so you would see a lot of people who are in leadership positions now stepping back because, well, it's an autonomous team, right? I can't interfere. That would be messing with their autonomy. My sense of this is that leadership is actually really important here, but not just any form of leadership. So what I mean by that, obviously, I could be a directive leadership. I could come in and I could tell you guys what I need you to do, when I need you to do it by, and how I need you to do it. That's probably not going to satisfy your psychological needs, right? So it's not just that leadership is important, but it's the style of leadership. So we looked at empowering leadership. And by empowering leadership, we mean, you know, a leader who provides choice to his people, provides coaching, provides information and context around the work that we're doing, understands the staff perspective. You may not find it interesting. You may not really like kind of what we're doing. To listen to people when they have those issues is important. And to encourage self-initiation, really, really important. Okay, so that was kind of the hypothesis that we developed.